On a September morning in 1981, a ranch dog in Wyoming walked up to the house carrying something dead in its mouth and dropped it by the door. The dog was called Shep. The ranch sat outside a small town called Meeteetse, in open country where the nearest neighbor is a long drive away. The animal in his mouth was small, slender, pale yellow, with dark feet, a dark tail tip, and a black mask across the face like a bandit. Nobody on the ranch recognized it. It did not look like a weasel they knew, and it did not look like anything they had seen before, so they did what people out there did with an odd animal. They took it into town to have it mounted. The taxidermist looked at it and stopped, because 2 years earlier, the black-footed ferret had been officially considered gone. The last known individual anywhere on Earth had died in captivity in 1979, and with it, the species was written off. Scientists had already accepted that North America had lost its only native ferret. There was no population left to find. There was nothing to look for. And a dog had just carried one to a back door. What followed was not a simple happy ending. In the next 4 years, that rediscovered population would rise, then collapse almost overnight. And a small group of biologists would be forced into a decision so unpopular that people accused them of finishing the species themselves. And the final piece of the rescue would not come from the prairie at all. It would come out of a freezer, from an animal that had been dead for more than 30 years. Take 1 second to subscribe before we dive in. You will not want to miss where this one ends. To understand how a whole species can vanish and then reappear in the mouth of a dog, you have to understand what a black-footed ferret actually is and what it eats. It is a slim, low, fast predator, built like a tube with legs, made for going down holes. It is nocturnal. It is rarely seen even where it is common. And it is one of the most specialized predators on the continent, because almost its entire life is built around a single other animal. Prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are not dogs. They are burrowing rodents that live in enormous underground colonies across the grasslands of North America. Their towns once stretched for tens of kilometers, with millions of animals connected by tunnels beneath the plains. The black-footed ferret evolved inside that world. Prairie dogs make up the overwhelming majority of what it eats, roughly 9 out of every 10 meals. It hunts them by going down into their tunnels at night, and it does not dig its own home. It lives in the burrows of the animals it hunts, sleeping in the tunnels of its own prey. That is an extremely efficient way to live, and an extremely dangerous one. It means the ferret does not simply prefer prairie dogs. It cannot exist without them. Its food, its shelter, and its whole territory are one animal. Whatever happens to prairie dogs happens to ferrets, with a short delay. The numbers behind that dependence are brutal. A single black-footed ferret eats roughly 100 prairie dogs in a year, and a female raising a litter needs more than that inside a small area, because she cannot travel far while she has young underground. Keeping a genuinely self-sustaining ferret population going needs a complex of colonies covering thousands of hectares. This is not an animal that can survive on a remnant patch. It needs the prairie working at scale, the way it worked before anyone arrived with a plow. It is also almost impossible to survey. A black-footed ferret spends most of its life underground, comes out mainly in the middle of the night, and moves low and fast through grass. The standard way of counting them is to drive across prairie dog colonies in the dark with spotlights and watch for a pair of green reflective eyes appearing at the mouth of a burrow for a second or two. That is how the species is monitored. It explains how an entire population could sit undetected for years within driving distance of a small town. And what happened to prairie dogs was deliberate. As farming and ranching spread across the plains, prairie dogs were treated as a pest. They ate grass that ranchers wanted for cattle, and their burrows were blamed for injuring livestock. So for decades, campaigns were run to remove them, with poison, with gas, with organized shooting, across enormous areas of the West. This was not an accident or a side effect. It was policy, carried out on purpose, year after year, over huge stretches of country. At the same time, the grasslands themselves were being plowed for crops. Between the poisoning and the plowing, the prairie dog was pushed out of the overwhelming majority of the range it once occupied. Estimates put the loss at more than 95% of the original area. Then, on top of that, came something nobody planned. Around the beginning of the 20th century, a disease arrived in North America, carried on ships, and spread by fleas. It is called sylvatic plague, and it is caused by the same bacterium behind the human plagues of history. Prairie dogs had no evolutionary experience of it at all. When plague reaches a prairie dog colony, it does not thin it out. It can erase it. Whole towns, tens of thousands of animals, dead in a matter of weeks. And the black-footed ferret catches it too, and dies from it just as reliably. So the ferret was hit from 3 directions at once. Its food supply was poisoned on purpose, its habitat was plowed under, and a disease it had never met before began sweeping through both the prey and the predator. By the middle of the 20th century, sightings had become rare. By the 1960s, a small surviving population was found in South Dakota, and a few animals were taken into captivity. But the captive effort of that era did not succeed. The last of those animals died in 1979. That is the point at which the species was considered finished. No wild population known, no captive animals left, a closed case. 2 years later, Shep found one. When the identification was confirmed, biologists went out to the Meeteetse area and began searching in earnest, and what they found was better than anyone had dared to hope. This was not one lost survivor. There was a whole population out there, living quietly in the prairie dog colonies around that ranch, unnoticed for years. By the middle of the 1980s, surveys were counting well over 100 animals, with a peak of roughly 129. For a few years, it looked like the story was going to be simple. The species had never actually gone extinct. It had been overlooked. Now it was found, it could be studied, protected, and left to recover in place. There were serious arguments at the time that the best thing to do was to leave the animals alone and manage the land around them. Then, in 1985, the population fell off a cliff. 2 diseases hit at once. Plague moved through the prairie dog colonies, destroying the food supply out from under the ferrets, and canine distemper, a virus that black-footed ferrets are extremely vulnerable to, moved through the ferrets themselves. Distemper in this species is close to a death sentence. Once it is inside a small population, it does not stop. The counts went from over 100 to a handful in a matter of months. Biologists watched the only known population of a species disappear in real time, and they had no way to stop either disease in the field. This is where the hardest decision in the story was made. A small team argued that the only way to save the species was to take every remaining animal out of the wild and put them in captivity. Not some of them, all of them. Empty the last population completely, and accept that for a period of years the black-footed ferret would not exist in the wild anywhere on Earth. The objections were fierce, and they were not stupid. Captive breeding of this species had been tried before and had failed. Taking every last animal into cages meant that if the captive program failed again, there would be no wild population left as a backup, and the people who removed them would have carried out the final act of the extinction themselves. Local landowners were also deeply unhappy, since the presence of the ferrets brought federal attention onto private ranch land. But the counter-argument was simply arithmetic. Distemper and plague were still moving. The animals left in the field were being killed faster than they could breed. Leaving them there was not a neutral choice. It was choosing a slower version of the same ending. So, between 1985 and 1987, the last black-footed ferrets were caught, one at a time, and taken into captivity. When it was finished, the number of black-footed ferrets remaining in the wild was 0, and the number in human care was 18. 18 animals. That was the entire species. And it was worse than 18, because not all of them bred. Some were too old. Some were related in ways that made them useless as separate bloodlines. Some simply never produced young that survived. When the genetics were worked out later, it turned out that the entire modern population traces back to only 7 successful founders. 7 animals stand behind every black-footed ferret alive today. The early captive breeding was slow, tense, and repeatedly close to failure. The species is difficult. Females come into breeding condition for a narrow window. Young are fragile. The whole population was kept split between separate facilities, because one disease outbreak in one building could have taken everything. Staff worked under conditions closer to a hospital than a zoo, because a single infection reaching those cages would have ended the species with no possible recovery. The first season was the worst of it. The animals had been taken out of a population that was already sick, and disease followed them indoors. Some of the captured ferrets died before they ever bred. For a period, the entire species consisted of a small number of animals in a handful of rooms, several of them elderly, several of them ill, and the program did not yet know whether any of them would produce young at all. Every objection that had been raised against the capture looked, for a while, like it was about to be proved right. Then, in 1987, the first kits were born in captivity, and the argument was effectively settled. It had worked, barely, and only just in time. Over the following years, the breeding program was deliberately spread across multiple institutions in different parts of the country, so that no single fire, storm, power failure, or outbreak could ever again put the whole species in one building. Then, it started to work. Kits were born, numbers grew, and by 1991, only a few years after the wild population had hit zero, the first captive-bred black-footed ferrets were released back onto the prairie in Wyoming. That is usually where a story like this would stop. But releasing them turned out to be the beginning of a much longer problem, because the reason they disappeared in the first place had not gone away. The ferrets needed prairie dogs. Prairie dogs were still greatly reduced, still unpopular with many landowners, and still exposed to plague. Release sites had to be chosen where prairie dog colonies were big enough to feed a ferret population, and where landowners would tolerate them. Then plague would arrive at a site and remove the prairie dogs, and the ferret population there would collapse behind them. There was also a problem with the ferrets themselves. Animals raised entirely in cages were bad at being wild. Young ferrets released straight from captivity had poor survival because they had never learned to hunt in tunnels or avoid predators above ground. So the program built outdoor pre-release pens, essentially training grounds with real burrows and live prairie dogs, where young ferrets spend time learning to hunt before being released. Survival improved sharply after that change. And against plague, the response has been unusually direct. Ferrets are vaccinated. Prairie dog colonies at release sites are treated to kill the fleas that spread the disease, sometimes by hand, burrow by burrow, and more recently, with oral vaccine baits distributed across colonies, in some cases dropped from vehicles or drones across the grassland. This is not a one-off action. It has to be repeated, on schedule, forever, because plague is now a permanent part of the North American landscape, and it is not going away. Which leaves the last problem, and it is the one that cannot be solved with vaccines or fences. 7 founders. Every black-footed ferret in existence is descended from those 7 animals. That is an extraordinarily narrow base. It means the species carries very little genetic variation, which raises the risk of inherited defects, reduces fertility over time, and makes the whole population more likely to share the same weakness against any new disease. You can protect a species from plague and predators and still lose it slowly to its own genetics. And this is where the freezer comes in. Back in the 1980s, when the last animals were being taken into captivity, tissue samples from some of them were frozen and stored as part of a long-running effort to bank cells from endangered species. Among those samples were cells from a female called Willa. Willa was one of the animals from the Meeteetse population. She died without leaving any descendants at all, so her genes disappeared from the species entirely. Her frozen cells sat in storage for more than 30 years. In 2020, a black-footed ferret kit was born. That was not the daughter of any living animal. She was a clone, produced from those frozen cells, and she was named Elizabeth Ann. She was the first cloned individual of any endangered species native to the United States. The purpose was not novelty. Willa carried genetic variation that no living ferret had because her line had died out. Cloning her put those genes back into a species that had almost none to spare. 2 more clones followed a few years later. And in 2024, one of them produced kits of her own, which meant the genes of an animal that died in the 1980s and left nothing behind had finally entered the living population more than 3 decades later. There are hard limits here, and they matter. Cloning does not create new genetic variation. It only recovers variation that was already stored before it was lost, which means it works only because somebody in the 1980s had the foresight to freeze tissue from animals nobody could save. It also does nothing about the underlying problem. A cloned ferret still needs prairie dogs, still needs grassland, and still dies of plague. And the species is not recovered. Black-footed ferrets remain one of the most endangered mammals in North America. The wild population is in the hundreds, spread across scattered reintroduction sites, most of which would not survive without ongoing management. Prairie dogs are still controlled and poisoned across much of their range, which means the food supply of the ferret is still actively reduced by human decisions. Plague still arrives without warning. If the vaccinations, the flea treatment, the captive breeding, and the releases stopped, the wild population would very likely start disappearing site by site. So this is not a story about an animal that was saved. It is a story about an animal that is being held up, continuously, by people who cannot put it down. But it is also true that in 1987, there were 18 black-footed ferrets alive on Earth, all of them in cages, and none of them in the wild. Today, there are thousands that have been born through the program, hundreds living on the prairie, and animals hunting in tunnels in states where the species had been absent for generations. None of that would exist without a ranch dog. Shep died not long after, and there is a small memorial in Meeteetse marking what he did. He was not trying to rescue anything. He killed a small animal on his own land, as ranch dogs do, and he carried it home. But that single carcass is the reason anyone knew there was still a population out there, and it arrived 2 years after the world had already closed the file. The species had been declared gone. Nobody was looking. And the only reason the black-footed ferret exists today is that one dog did not understand that it was supposed to be extinct. If you enjoy true stories of animals pulled back from the very edge, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another species that the world had already written off. Take care of yourself and stay curious.